Once branded Australia's worst female serial killer, Kathleen Folbigg spent 20 years in prison for the alleged murder of her 4 children, but she was wrongfully convicted. Genetic evidence proved her innocence, and the $2 million she's been offered in compensation hardly scratches the surface of this miscarriage of justice. This is the story of Kathleen Folbigg and her agonising fight for true justice. But first, let's rewind to the very beginning of this life-altering ordeal, to the very moment where a cascading series of events led to a wrongful conviction. Kathleen and Craig's firstborn son, Caleb, was born on February 1st, 1989, and within hours of his birth, Caleb showed mild respiratory distress, and this was thought to be harmless by his paediatricians. But then by mid-February his raspy breathing persisted, although the doctors thought that this would resolve naturally. Then on February 20, Kathleen fed Caleb around 1 a.m. in the morning and noted in a diary that he's finally fallen asleep. And then by 2:50 a.m. she went in and checked on him and found that he was cold. Craig was woken up by her screams and found Caleb unresponsive, blue-lipped and eyes closed, but still warm. He tried CPR while Kathleen called for an ambulance, and paramedics arrived moments later and confirmed the worst. Caleb was in cardiac arrest, and at just 19 days old, he was gone. The cause of death remained a mystery. And then some exciting news. By June 3rd, 1990, Kathleen and Craig's second child, Patrick, was born. After the trauma of losing their first child, Craig decided to take 3 months off work to support Kathleen. I think this reveals how deeply they were struggling and how desperately they wanted to give Patrick the best chance at life. And during his short life, Patrick was seen several times by the family GP, who described Kathleen as a caring and attentive mother. There was no signs of neglect, and then, on the morning of February 13, 1991, it happened again. Kathleen put Patrick to bed as usual, and then hours later, Craig received a panic call from Kathleen. "It's happened again. I need you, come home." He raced back to find Patrick unresponsive in his cot. Craig began CPR until the paramedics arrived and took over. Then, just as suddenly, Patrick was raced to hospital while paramedics desperately tried to save his tiny life. And sadly, Patrick was pronounced dead on arrival at the emergency department. After the heartbreak of losing Patrick and Caleb, the Folbiggs packed up their lives and moved to Thornton. It was a fresh start, or at least the one they hoped for. Then, just a year later, Kathleen was pregnant again. This time, they were expecting a daughter. And Sarah was born on October 14, 1992. After the devastating loss of Caleb and Patrick, her arrival must have seemed like a fragile miracle. At first, Sarah seemed healthy. She saw the family GP 4 times for routine checkups, mostly vaccines. She was a normal, thriving baby. There was no warning, there were no signs of what was to come. But on the night of August 29, 1993, something went terribly wrong. Kathleen later told the police that she had gone to the toilet around 1:30 in the morning, and when she returned to the bedroom, Sarah hadn't stirred, and that's when she noticed her daughter wasn't breathing. Craig's account was entirely different. He said that he woke up at 1:10 in the morning and noticed that both Kathleen and Sarah were gone, and that the light was on, and that discrepancy would become one of the most haunting details of this case. And then around 1:30 a.m, paramedics arrived at the Folbigg home. Kathleen met them at the door and she led them to the bedroom where Craig was performing CPR on Sarah. Sarah had stopped breathing, and despite all efforts, Sarah sadly passed away at 2:10 in the morning. In the report by the paramedics, they said that Kathleen told them that Sarah hadn't woken up since she was put down to bed earlier that night, and she said that she usually stirs around midnight, but hadn't this time. The paramedics listed as the chief complaint SIDS, or sudden infant death syndrome. However, in the police report, it was noted that Sarah was the Folbigg's third child and that both her brothers had died of SIDS in the past 5 years. The police also recorded that Sarah was tucked up in a single bed in her parents' room around 9 p.m. She was snoring when they went to bed, and then at 1:30 a.m, Kathleen reportedly got up and noticed the silence. She turned on the light and saw her daughter's face was blue. 3 children, 3 sudden deaths, all under the age of 5, and all initially ruled as SID. But the inconsistency in the accounts between Craig and Kathleen and the growing unease would soon cast a very long shadow over Kathleen. Despite these mounting doubts, life carried on, and then the couple relocated in 1996, seeking a fresh start in Singleton, a quiet town 70k northeast of Sydney. Then on the 7th of August 1997, Laura was born, and that was their 4th and last child together, and the only one to live past infancy. But then on March 1st, 1999, paramedics were once again called to the Folbigg home. Laura was found unresponsive on the breakfast bar while Kathleen was performing CPR. The paramedics checked for signs of life. There was no pulse, there was no breathing, and Laura was rushed to hospital. Kathleen said that she heard Laura coughing 5 minutes earlier and then found her pale and not breathing. Laura had been sick with a cold and was given cold and flu medication, and she was last fed at 7 a.m. She had been put to sleep on her side but was found on her back. But this time, the questions from the police seemed to be getting louder, and they weren't going away. One of the most damning pieces of evidence used against Kathleen wasn't forensic, but from her personal diaries. No one knows exactly when Kathleen began journaling. The earliest surviving entry dates back to Patrick's birth in 1990 and continued through their lives and deaths. The diary entries were raw, they were disjointed, they were grief-stricken and deeply personal. At trial, the Crown argued they were a window into guilt, a private confession written in fragments. But as we will see, the truth is much more complicated than that. And in this entry made on the 3rd of June 1990, Kathleen wrote, "This was the day that Patrick Alan David Folbigg was born. I had mixed feelings this day, whether or not I was going to cope as a mother or whether I was going to get stressed out like I did last. I often regret Caleb and Patrick only because your life changes so much, and maybe I'm not a person that likes change, but we'll see." Certainly, reading this in isolation, this entry could be misconstrued as cold or incriminating, but if reading through a trauma-informed lens, it reflects a woman who is grappling with grief, identity, and emotional regulation. It's not a confession, it's a snapshot of psychological struggle, and that distinction matters deeply in any fair assessment of her case. The prosecution saw this as a confession, but modern psychologists looked at it differently. They saw a woman struggling with her own mental health and writing to cope. In another diary entry on June 22nd, 1996, Kathleen wrote, "I watched a movie today about schizophrenia, wondered if I have a mild curse of that. I change moods really quickly. In my most dangerous mood, I'm not nice to be around and always want to be anywhere but where I am." This entry doesn't point to guilt, it points to struggle. It reveals a woman grappling with her own internal emotional landscape, trying to name what she feels and fearing how it might affect those around her. In a courtroom, this kind of vulnerability was weaponized against Kathleen, but in a therapeutic or trauma-informed context, it stands as a signpost for compassion. However, psychologists in the 2003 trial saw it entirely differently. They thought the entries revealed a greatly tormented and exceedingly disturbed woman. In fact, one psychologist said that Kathleen carried intense shame and guilt over her children's death. But when he spoke with her directly, he noted something quite unsettling, an emotional flatness, Particularly when she spoke about losing them, there were only brief flickers of sadness. Another psychologist saw the diaries differently. He believed they were an outlet for Kathleen to release her anger, frustration, and possibly even dark, intrusive thoughts. He suggested her depression may have impaired her ability to regulate her emotion and behaviour at the time of the deaths. The lingering question here at trial became, were those pages a cry for help or a confession? Were they the private unravelling of a grieving mother or the evidence of something much more sinister? And the prosecution chose the latter. These words, never meant for a courtroom, became the cornerstone of a case that would define Kathleen's life and were weaponised in court and became the prosecution's so-called smoking gun, even though there was no forensic evidence to link Kathleen to the murders. Alas, on October 24, 2003, Kathleen's fate was sealed. The jury found her guilty not just of manslaughter in Caleb's death, but of grievous bodily harm against Patrick and the murders of Sarah, Patrick and Laura. 4 children, 4 devastating losses for Kathleen, now 4 convictions that resulted in a lengthy prison term. Justice Barr described Kayla's death as the result of uncontrollable anger, a moment of emotional collapse for a young, inexperienced mother who, until then, had lived life without violence. But when it came to Patrick's second collapse, the judge thought that Kathleen had made a decision, that she could no longer tolerate his presence and that she intended to end his life. And with Sarah and Laura, the language was even starker. There was no room for doubt, the judge said. Their deaths were from asphyxiation and suffocation, and they were deliberate. It was a damning conclusion, not built on forensic certainty, but on interpretation and false assumption. And yet, behind the solemn weight of courtroom testimony, unease remained. Doubts about the science, whispers about Kathleen's motives, and the haunting possibility that the raw, unfettered grief had been misread as something far more sinister. Kathleen's wrongful conviction is now regarded as one of most Australia's most infamous miscarriages of justice. And for Kathleen herself, this marked the beginning of a very long, painful chapter in her life, one that would take 2 decades to unravel. So who was Kathleen Folbigg? Well, she entered the world in Sydney on June 14, 1967, but her childhood was shattered before she could even form lasting memories. At just 18 months old, grief once again descended in the most brutal way. On January 8, 1969, her biological father, Thomas or Taffy Britton, stabbed her mother, Kathleen Donovan, 24 times. The violence was so extreme and so personal, it left a scar not just on the family, but on a child who would grow up in its shadows. Britton was arrested that very next day, and after serving his sentence, he was deported back to England, leaving Kathleen orphaned and adrift. With both parents gone, the state stepped in. Kathleen was placed with a foster couple, but that arrangement quickly unravelled. Then by July 1970, she was moved to the Burdura Children's Home, a place remembered not for its warm embraces, but more for its cold corridors. 2 months later, she found herself in permanent foster care. But an exciting development happened on March 2022, and the case took a whole new direction thanks to over 100 scientists and medical professionals and the discovery of a rare genetic mutation that linked to sudden cardiac death and epilepsy, and the conviction was overturned. 3 forensic pathologists stood before the inquiry and said what the original trial never fully considered was if the children had died of natural causes. But that was just the beginning. Experts in infection, immunology and neurology and genetics were brought in, and they revealed something extraordinary, a rare genetic mutation in Kathleen's DNA. One of those mutations was known to cause cardiac arrhythmias and sudden heart failure. Her daughters had inherited it, and that mutation, they said, was not just plausible, it was likely. So now we have scientific explanations for the deaths of the 2 children. But what about the boys? They didn't carry the same heart gene. But they did carry another mutation, and this one was linked to fatal epilepsy. At trial, the Crown had claimed that before 2003, there were no known cases of 3 or more infants' deaths in one family from natural causes. Think about that for a moment. The jury was told it was impossible for 3 children in one family to die of natural causes. This claim wasn't just wrong, but it was the entire foundation of the case against her. It tilted the entire jury away from science and towards a theory of murder. During cross-examination, Kathleen Folbigg denied killing her children, not once and not twice, but 70 times. And yet the damage was already done. Misinformation had swept into the courtroom, shaping a narrative that led to her conviction, before the truth ever had a chance to speak. Since being imprisoned, 20 years passed, and that's how long Kathleen spent behind bars, branded as a child killer, isolated from the world, grieving not just for her children, but the loss of her own identity within society. And when the truth finally caught up, when science, reason and justice aligned, she walked free, but not as a whole person. She was handed $2 million in compensation, roughly $100,000 for every year stolen. But as her legal team pointed out, that figure doesn't even cover her lost wages for the last 20 years, let alone the psychological and emotional cost that she has borne. For perspective, legal experts say true compensation for Kathleen's suffering should be around $10 million or more. What she got was not a payment for justice, it was an insult. Would you trade 2 decades of your life for $100,000 per year of imprisonment? 20 years of missed birthdays, lost friendships, and relentless public vilification. Kathleen didn't just lose time, she lost the chance to grieve for her children without suspicion. The system had failed her in a most grievous way and then moved on as if nothing had happened. No one was held accountable for the flawed assumptions that gave rise to Kathleen's murder convictions. This very personal tragedy was an orchestrated narrative constructed on flawed assumptions and poor analysis, and where mere speculation masqueraded as truth. And when justice finally arrived, it limped in late and empty-handed. Kathleen Folbigg walked free, but justice limped behind her, and when it finally caught up, it handed her a cheque instead of an apology. The Kathleen Folbigg case is more than just a personal tragedy. It's a warning about wrongful convictions, flawed expert evidence, and how easily the criminal justice system can fail. If Kathleen Folbigg's wrongful conviction shows us anything, it's how fragile justice can be. If you believe in exposing miscarriages of justice and learning from cases like this, please like, share and subscribe to this channel. The more we shine a light on the failures of the justice system, the better chance we have of preventing them. And until next time, take care.